Hey guys, welcome back. We'll continue building out our Django app. In the last video we covered how we can set up Django and create our project. If you haven't seen it, it's linked up here. In this video we're going to cover how to work with databases. We're going to set up the database, make sure that we can keep track of questions and answers for our polls app, and then migrate the database. Let's get right into it. Now in the previous episode we installed Python and set up our Django application. We set up the My Site project here with the default settings.py and urls.py file. And then we went ahead and we created an additional polls application. And here we created the urls.py file and we set up our basic view, which looks like this. So when we navigate to our localhost and then to polls, then we can see this particular string that is rendered to us. Of course, that's not too exciting yet, and therefore we're going to get started working with databases. And in general, we're going to start out by configuring our database in the settings.py file, which is part of the My Site project. So if we open this up, we can see we already have some default configuration included. We have, for example, a list of the installed apps that come with our application. And we also have our databases configuration. So this is the default entry here, which is using SQLite, which is a very small scale database that's mostly used for testing purposes because it's not really usable if we want to use it in production with a lot of different users. If we wanted to use a different database, for example PostgreSQL or MySQL, then we would adjust the engine here and also the name, and we would change it to, for example, PostgreSQL or MySQL depending on which kind of database we want to use. We would then also need to provide the username, the password, and the host for our database that we're working with. And of course, we would need to make sure that we actually create and set up the database. So for example, the PostgreSQL database. We're going to use SQLite though, and therefore we don't need to make any changes here. The only thing we need to adjust is if we scroll down a little bit more. Here we can see the time zone entry, and we need to adjust that to our own time zone. So here I'm going to set the time zone to Europe/Berlin, which is where I'm located. And you would have to set your time zone accordingly. I'm going to add a link in the description down below to get an overview of the different available time zones. After that, we can scroll back up and take a look at the installed app list here. And here we have an overview of the different default apps that automatically come with Django. And these apps contain functionality that's frequently used when working with Django applications. So first we have the admin side app, and we're going to see what that does in a moment. So basically we can use it to basically manage the different questions we're going to create for our polls app. Then we have our authentication app, which is used to log in and sign out of our application. We have a framework for content types and also a session framework. And then we can also manage messages with a messages framework. And finally, we have the static files framework, which is used for managing static files such as images or CSS files, for example. Now, some of these applications here use at least one database table, and we need to make sure to create those tables before we can actually use them. And in order to do that, we are going to use the migrate command, which looks at the installed app list and creates any necessary database tables in this settings.py file, as well as the database migrations that automatically come with Django. So to do that, we can head over to our terminal, and then we can stop our development server by pressing Ctrl+C if it's still running. And then we're going to type in python manage.py and then migrate. And this is going to apply those migrations. If you think back, when we first started up our server, we got a warning that there were 18 unapplied migrations. These are the ones we just applied. So now we have that functionality that is provided with those default apps, and it is basically available in the database. As an aside, if you don't need all of these installed apps, prior to migrating them, we could have also commented out the ones we don't need, and then those migrations would have been skipped, and only the ones that are not commented out would have been executed. Now, aside from these default migrations, we are also going to work with some additional entries in the database, and to create those, we need to define our models. And a model is basically a database layout that we define. So a model is basically a single definite source of information about our data, and it contains the essential fields and behavior of the data that we are storing. And this also includes migrations. So once we define the models, we would then create migrations and migrate them to actually create those entries in the database. So to make it specific, what we need for our polls app is a way to keep track of the questions that we want to ask and also of the choices that are available. And since these are part of the polls application, we need to have a look at polls. And here we can see we have the models.py module, which we can open. And we are already importing the models module here. So let's next create two classes, one for the questions and one for the choices. And it's important that our question class actually inherits from models.model to actually have those functionalities included that we need in order to properly migrate the data. And each model has a number of different class variables, each of which represents a database field in the model. And then each field is represented by an instance of a field class. So for instance, here we have our question text, and we are using the char field class here to define that this should be a text field with a maximum length of 200 characters. And as a second entry here, we have our publication date. For that, we are going to use the datetime field class, and we pass a string to it called date published. Next up, we are going to create our choice model. And again, we need to make sure to inherit from models.model. And as our first field for the choice model, we are going to set up the question field here. And this ensures that the choice is connected to a question that we set up. So each question can have multiple choices associated with it. And to create this connection between the choice model and the question model, we're using the foreign key class to ensure that each choice is connected with a question. And we also specify what should happen on delete. So when a question is deleted, then we want to make sure that we are cascading everything associated with that question. So if we have, for example, 3 choices associated with our question, then once we delete that question, all 3 choices should be deleted as well. Of course, our choice also needs some text. So here we are going to use the char field class, just as we did with the question text here, and we are also going to restrict it to a length of 200 characters. It means each choice is represented as a text with a maximum length of 200 characters. And then we also want to have a certain number of votes for each choice, so users will be able to vote on each choice, and therefore we are going to set the votes up as an integer field, and by default they're going to be 0 votes associated with each choice. And of course, later on, there will be a way to vote up the different choices. Now, this model code that we wrote gives Django a lot of information. So with this, Django will be able to create a database schema and then also create a Python database access API for accessing the question and choice objects. But in order to do that, we first need to tell Django that our polls app that we created is installed. And for that, we are going to head back to the settings file, which is part of our MySite project. So if we open that up, we can think back to the installed apps list. These were the default apps, but since we created our own app, after that we need to tell Django that this should actually be used so that we can properly run the migration for the model that we just defined. So to do that, all we need to do is to add an additional entry in here. And for this, we're going to need to navigate to the polls directory, then to the apps module here. And inside of our apps module, we have our class polls config, which we are going to take, and this is what we need to add inside of the installed apps. Now by doing this, we are telling Django that this additional app is installed, and therefore by telling this to Django and defining the models module, we can then run the migrations to create the database entries to define our question and choice model. Now for this, we can open our terminal and we can type in python manage.py as before. And this time we're going to use a new command called migrations, and then we need to provide the name of the app for which we want to create migrations, so in our case for the polls app. When we press enter, we can see that we created 2 new migrations, one to create the question model and one to create the choice module, which of course are exactly those 2 entries that we created here inside of models.py. And make migrations tells Django that we have made some changes to our model and that we'd like the changes to be stored as a migration. And migrations are how Django stores changes to our models, and therefore the database schema, they're basically files on disk. Now there's a command we can issue that will run the migrations for us and then also manage the database schema automatically. That's the migrate command, which we briefly saw before. But let's first have a look what SQL migrations would actually run. And for that, we can go ahead and we can type out python manage.py SQL migrate, and then we want to migrate part of our polls app and specifically our initial migration, which is called 0001. So as we type this out and press enter, we can see the actual SQL commands. So here at the beginning, we are creating our question model, and these are the actual SQL statements that are being executed. So we are creating a new database table We are setting the primary key, for instance, and of course the different attributes, so the question text here, and also the publication date, which is a datetime object. And then of course we have our second migration. Here we are creating the choice model, and we are creating an additional table for that as well. And of course we are also adding the primary key here to create the connection between the choice and the question. And at the end here, after doing that, we are committing those changes to the database. But the SQL migrate command actually doesn't run migration on our database, but it just shows us what will be run once we issue the migrate command. So this gives us an overview of the actual SQL that will be triggered. But in order to do the migration, we actually need to type out Python manage py, and we type in migrate. And once we press enter, we can see the migrations are applied. And here we are running the new migration we created for a new polls app. And we can see, okay, so everything was migrated properly. So the migrate command takes all the migrations that we have applied and then runs them against our database and basically synchronizes the changes that we've made to our models with the schema in the database. And the migrations are very powerful because they allow us to incrementally change our models over time. So we don't need to delete our database or tables and make new ones, but instead our migrations basically keep track of the different changes, and we can run them one after another, and this is going to apply the different changes which are necessary. So just to briefly recap, we would always follow those steps. We would first of all define the models inside of our models.py file. Then we would switch over to the terminal and make sure that we actually make the migrations using the migrations command followed by the name of the migration. And then we would issue the migrate command to actually execute those migrations and make those changes to the database. Now, after we made those changes to the database, we can actually have a look at our database and use the Django API to create some entries. And to do that, we can go ahead and type out Python manage py followed by the shell command. And this is going to invoke the Python shell, which allows us to interact with the database. So we can start out by importing the model classes that we wrote. So here we are saying that from the polls directory, from the polls app, specifically from the models module here, we want to import the choice class and also the question class. And now we can first start out by having a look at all the different questions. So we are going to call question.objects.all, and we can see we have an empty query set. So at the moment we don't have any questions yet in our database. But of course we can create a new question. And since we also need a datetime object to create a new question, we need to import the time zone module. So we can type out from django.utils import time zone. Now after that we create a new question object. By instantiating our class question, we pass the question text to it. In this case, the question will be what's new. And we need to pass the publication date as a second argument. In this case, we are calling timezone.now to use the current date and time as the publication date. And if we have a look at question text and pub date, those of course are exactly those two entries that we can see here, the question text and the publication date, which we defined before as part of our question class here inside of our models module. Now let's confirm. And then we still need to make sure that we save the object in the database. So for that we are going to use the save method, which we call on our question object. Now we can go ahead and have a look at the ID of our question. We can see it's ID number 1 because it's the very first entry. And we could have a look at the different attributes. So for instance, we can have a look at the question text, which of course is the text we defined here. And we can also have a look at the publication date, which is a datetime object specifying the current date and the current local time. And now we can issue the same call as before, so question.objects.all, to have a look at all the question entries. And here of course we can see we have one question added to it, which is a question we just defined. But the entry here, question object 1, is not really that helpful. It would be much more helpful to have the actual question text returned to us. And to do that we need to make a small adjustment. So if we head back to our models.py module, we can add a new method to our question and also to our choice class. So here we define the str method and we're going to return the question text, and that ensures that when we actually issue that call again, that we actually get back the question text rather than the question object itself, and that's a lot more descriptive. And we need to do the same for our choice. So if we have a look at our choice, then we also want to get back the choice text, so we have something descriptive for both the choice and the question. While we're making those changes to our model, we can also add an additional custom method. So here as part of our question class, we're going to add an additional method called wasPublicedRecently, which is going to tell us whether a question was created recently. And here we're going to return a Boolean value. We are going to have a look at the publication date, and we're going to check whether it's greater than the current time subtracted from the time delta of 1 day ago. So if a question is no older than a day, then it would be published recently. Of course, we need to ensure that we import the appropriate modules. So therefore we can go to the very top of our models module, and we're going to import date time. And we also need to import the time zone module. This is part of Django utils. So we're going to import time zone, and then everything should work properly. Now, once we have those changes saved, we can go back to our terminal. And for this to be properly applied, we need to exit out by pressing Ctrl D out of our shell. And then we can restart our shell. And again, we need to make sure that we import our two classes. So from our models module, we're going to import both the choice and the question class. And now we can go ahead and we can use the same call again, question.objects.all. Now we can see this is much more descriptive. So now we get back the actual question text of that question, and so we know a lot better what kind of question is part of our question list. Now we can also filter based on certain questions. So for that we can type out question.objects.filter, and we can, for example, filter based on the ID, for example on the question with ID number 1, and that of course is this question over here. And Django even provides additional parameters, so we could go ahead and we can use the filter method here, and then we can type out question text starts with and provide, for example, the string what, and this is also going to return that question to us. So there are a number of different keyword arguments that are part of the Django API that we can use to very easily query for certain entries in our database, for example here for the different questions that we created. Let's also have a look at our time zone, so we can go ahead and from Django utils we can import the time zone module, and then we can define the current year, which we get back by calling timezone.now and getting the year attribute. And then we can call question.objects.get, and we want to check if the publication date here, and specifically the year, is equal to the current year. And of course we get all the questions back for which that entry is true. So here we get back the question that we created. Now if we try to query a question that doesn't exist, so in this case a question with ID number 2, then we're going to get back a does not exist error, because the query that we issued is not matching any of the questions that have been created. We can also query the primary key, which in the case of the question is the same as the ID. So in this case we can call question.objects.get and pass a primary key with a value of 1 to it. That's going to give us back the question. And of course we can use this call to get back our question object here and save that in a variable queue. Now we can have a look at the choices that are associated with the question. Since we defined the class choice before and set a foreign key, we know that we associated the choices with the question. So here we can call choice_set.all on queue, and we get an empty query set because we don't have any choices which are associated with our question yet. But we can create those choices, and for that we would call choice set on queue and then call create. We are providing the choice text, so in this case not much, and then also the number of votes, which we are going to set to 0. Of course, choice text and votes again matches exactly those attributes that we defined inside of the choice class. So we created our first choice. We can then just press the up key to provide a second choice. So in that case, we are going to call it the sky, also with 0 votes. And then we can create a third choice, which we could call just hacking again with 0 votes. And then we have 3 choices that are associated with our question. So to have a look at that, we can go ahead and call choice set all on queue. And this is going to show us all the choices that are associated with our question. We can also call the count method on choice set, and this shows us that we have a total of 3 different choices. Now let's finally query the last choice that we created by calling the filter method and passing choice text __ starts with, and we pass the string just hacking to it, which of course gives us back this object here. And then we could delete that entry by just calling the delete method on it. So now we deleted this method, So if we had a look at all the choices again, we can see we now have a total of 2 choices in our database. And that's just a quick impression of how we can use the shell to issue those commands. And of course the filtering and other commands can also be executed from within our Django application. So let's press Ctrl D to quit our shell. And let's switch gears a little bit and let's actually create a Django admin user, which we can then use to manage the different entries in our database using the browser web interface. And for that, of course, we are going to use our Python manage py command again. This time we are going to type out create super user. And this is used to create an admin user. So once we press that, we can provide a username. So I'm going to call that username admin. Then we can provide an email address, for example, admin@example.com. Can be any fictitious email address. And then we need to provide a password. And we need to repeat the password again. And now we can see that the super user was created successfully. Now at this point, we can go ahead and start our development server again by typing out Python manage py run server. And as before, we can press Ctrl and then click on the URL of our development server and click on open link to open our development server. Of course, we need to navigate to Polls to see our Polls application. But what we actually want to do is to head over to admin and then press enter. And this will show us this Django admin screen, and here we can provide the username and the password of the super user that we just created. So that will be the username, and I'm going to type in the password that I just defined and press enter. And then we are signed into the Django admin side. And by default, we can see the various groups and also add new users to our Django site. But what we want to actually do is to make the Polls app that we are creating modifiable by an admin so that an admin can create new questions and also new choices directly from this panel here. And to do that, we need to head back to our Django application, and specifically inside of our Polls app, we need to navigate to admin.py. And here we can register different models which should then be visible to an admin. So an admin can create new questions, for instance. So for that, we need to go ahead and first of all, we need to make sure that we are actually importing our question model from our models module. And once we've done that, once we ensure that our question class from our models module is imported, then we can type out admin.site.register, and then we pass the class name to it, so the question model here, and we can save this. And once we head back to our site, we can reload. And now we can see that we have a new entry here, part of our Polls apps that we created, and specifically we can now see the different questions. So if we click on that, we can see the question that we already created, what's new, by using the Python shell before. And if we click on that, we can see the publication date. And of course, we could adjust the date and the time if we wanted to. So if we wanted to make a change to our question text, for example, we could type in here and let's change the question tag from what's new to what's up. And we can click on save, and then those changes are adjusted. And this is the end of our database setup. In the next video, we are going to have a look at how we can display those questions in the UI and how we can make changes to the front end of our application. Just to briefly recap, we learned about the default settings in the settings module, specifically the installed apps that automatically come with Django. And we also learned how we can register additional apps. So for example, here our Polls app that we added to the list of installed apps. We also learned how we can create additional database entries by using the models module, which is part of the apps that we created. And to do that, we would make sure that we create those new models as classes. And then we define the different attributes by using the different model classes. For example, here the char field class for text fields or the datetime field for date picker fields. We then also learned that we can create migrations by using the make migrations command, and we also learned that we can use the migrate command to then apply those migrations and perform changes to the database. We also had a quick look at how we can use the Python shell to use the Django API to add new entries to our database and also to query for certain entries, for example for questions or for choices using the Django API. And then finally we covered how we can create a new super user in Django and how we can then sign into the Django administration with that super user and create new entries in our database, for example, new question entries. And in order to see those models in our administration, we needed to make sure that we headed over to the admin module inside of our Polls app. We imported the model that we want to see in the administration by calling admin side register and then passing the specific class to it. And then as we reloaded the administration page here in the Django administration, we saw that entry added to the administration. If you found this video helpful and you want to get notified when the next video is released, feel free to subscribe to the channel, and see you guys in the next video when we take a look at the user interface in Django.